The wind whispered through the towering pines as the human made his way deeper into the forest, each step careful and deliberate. He was a scientist, equipped with state-of-the-art survival gear, yet the untamed wilderness around him was a reminder of just how fragile his existence was. In this isolated corner of the earth, the ecosystem was king, and humans were mere guests. Yet, there was something undeniably alluring about this place, a sense of adventure mixed with a quiet, foreboding tension. The grizzly bear was a creature of legend in this part of the forest, a beast that commanded respect from all who ventured near. Her size alone was enough to make even the bravest hunter pause, and her speed was unmatched when provoked. To the local wildlife, she was both predator and protector, a queen of the wild whose every move shaped the balance of life in the forest. It was said that no one had ever witnessed her up close without paying the price. That was until the human found himself standing on the edge of her territory. He knew better than to venture too far into the dense woods without a plan. He had prepared for this moment for months, gathering data, testing theories, and equipping himself with tools that could help him survive. Yet, nothing could have prepared him for the weight of the encounter that was unfolding. His heart raced as he noticed movement in the distance, a blur of brown fur that was unmistakably the bear. The sight sent a chill down his spine, but it was not fear that held him in place, it was awe. The human crouched, blending into the underbrush, trying to remain invisible. He had heard the stories of the bear's fierce maternal instincts and knew better than to underestimate her. His eyes locked on her as she emerged from the shadows, her massive form moving with surprising grace despite her size. She was followed closely by two cubs, their small bodies wobbling to keep up with her deliberate pace. The human held his breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was a rare sight, a privilege that few could claim. But as he watched, something shifted in the atmosphere. The bear's eyes flicked toward him, locking onto his position with an intensity that made his heart skip. For a moment, he thought he had been detected, that he would pay the ultimate price for his curiosity. But instead of charging, the bear paused. Her gaze lingered on him, and there was something almost curious about it. Then, as if making a decision, she moved toward the trees, her cubs following closely behind. The human's breath returned, though he remained perfectly still. He knew that this moment would change everything. He had always considered himself a student of nature, but this encounter went beyond observation. The bear was not simply a wild animal to be studied, she was an agent of the forest, a creature whose every action held meaning in the greater balance of the world. The question that lingered in his mind was simple: why had she spared him? As he slowly rose to his feet, still cautious, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. The bear was returning, but this time, something was different. She was walking toward him, her eyes unwavering. His heart pounded in his chest, a primal instinct telling him to flee. But he couldn't move, not now. The distance between them closed, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he would make it out alive. Then, without warning, the grizzly stopped just a few feet away from him. To his shock, the bear lowered her head, nudging one of her cubs toward him. It was an unthinkable gesture. In all his studies, he had never seen such a thing. The cub looked up at him, its tiny eyes wide with innocence, and the human instinctively knelt down, reaching out a hand. The bear's gaze did not waver, her body tense and poised, but she did not intervene. She had made a choice. The cub, still unsure but trusting in its mother's command, stepped forward, accepting the human's outstretched hand. The moment was surreal, a mixture of fear, wonder, and confusion. What was happening? Why had the bear, a creature known for her savage nature, given up one of her cubs? There was something almost deliberate in her actions, as though this moment had been set in motion long before the human arrived. The human's mind raced, torn between the need to study the situation and the overwhelming sense of responsibility now thrust upon him. The cub, small and fragile, was in his care. He could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing down on him. This was no ordinary animal encounter, it was a turning point, an event that would change everything. But as the bear turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving her cub behind, the human knew one thing for certain: he was no longer just an observer of nature. He was a part of it now, forever intertwined with the forces that governed this wild, untamed world. The silence that followed was deafening. The human stood there, his mind grappling with the magnitude of the situation. The cub's soft whimpers broke the stillness, pulling him from his thoughts. There was no time to waste. The world had shifted, and he had to be ready for what was to come next. The human stood motionless, his hand still resting on the cub's small, trembling body. It felt surreal, as if the entire world had paused around him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible situation. The grizzly had left her cub, the cub had come to him willingly, and now he was faced with a decision he never expected. Why would a creature as fierce as a grizzly trust him? Was it an accident, or was there something deeper at play? The cub sniffed cautiously at his hand, its tiny claws gripping his palm as it adjusted to his presence. The human's thoughts churned, but he couldn't afford to waste time questioning the why. The bear was gone, and the moment was slipping away. He couldn't ignore the fact that the cub was vulnerable. It wasn't just any cub, it was the grizzly's cub, an integral part of the forest's hierarchy, and he was now in possession of it. He slowly stood up, careful not to startle the cub. His gear was light, just enough to keep him alive and functional in the wild. But it wasn't designed for caring for an animal. He couldn't feed it the way its mother would, couldn't protect it from threats in the way the grizzly could. But somehow, he had to find a way to keep it safe, to understand why this had happened. The answers were unclear, but he couldn't back away now. The human took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was a strange connection forming between him and the cub, a bond that transcended fear. It was as though the cub trusted him instinctively, despite everything the human had been taught about nature's brutal realities. He was an intruder in this forest, not meant to be here, and yet, this cub had come to him. For a long moment, he wondered if it was simply a fluke. Maybe the grizzly had seen something in him, something that allowed her to make the decision to leave the cub behind. He thought back to the way the bear had observed him earlier, not with aggression, but with something almost like curiosity. She had not seen him as a threat. In fact, she had treated him as part of the forest, as if he were a force of nature rather than an intruder. Could it be possible that the grizzly recognized a kindred spirit in him? The thought lingered, but it didn't ease the growing sense of responsibility. He wasn't prepared for this. He had come to study, to observe the wild, not to raise a bear cub. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of a forest, holding a creature that could very well become a powerful predator in its own right. A part of him wanted to deny the situation, to hand the cub back to the forest, to let nature take its course. But the trust in the cub's eyes, and the way the bear had entrusted him with its life, made that impossible. This wasn't a random event. It was a moment that had meaning, and he needed to understand it. The cub whimpered again, nudging its tiny head into his hand. It was small, vulnerable, and completely dependent on him now. The human's protective instincts kicked in. He would keep the cub safe, no matter the cost. The grizzly's decision had set something in motion, something that was bigger than him, bigger than the cub. He couldn't explain it, but it felt as if the universe had somehow shifted, pulling him into a new role. As the human moved deeper into the forest, the cub nestled against him for warmth, its tiny body trembling in his arms. He had no answers, no clear understanding of why this was happening. All he knew was that the bond had been forged, and it was his responsibility to honor it. He couldn't turn back now. There was something more at play here, and he would see it through to the end. In the back of his mind, a question nagged at him. What did the grizzly know that he didn't? Why had she chosen him? The answers were elusive, but he knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary encounter. The forest had drawn him in, and now, he was part of something much larger than he could possibly understand. His fate, and the cub's, were intertwined in ways he could not yet fathom. The bond between them had been sealed, and there was no going back. The human moved cautiously, the cub nestled in his arms, his every step deliberate as he tried to make sense of the strange bond that had formed. With each passing minute, the weight of the situation pressed harder on his shoulders. He wasn't just carrying a bear cub anymore, he was carrying a symbol. This act, this inexplicable gesture from the grizzly, felt like the beginning of something far beyond a mere animal encounter. It was a turning point, an event that could alter everything. As the hours passed and the silence of the forest wrapped around him, the human's mind raced. Why had the bear left her cub? Why had she trusted him? There had to be a deeper purpose behind it, something that went beyond animal instinct. This wasn't a chance encounter, it was a carefully orchestrated moment. He could feel it in his bones. The cub, now curled against him, seemed content, as though it had accepted its new reality. Its trust in him was absolute, and that only deepened the human's sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about survival anymore. There was something else at play, something that transcended his understanding of the natural world. The human's thoughts drifted back to the grizzly's actions. There had been no aggression, no hostility. Instead, the bear had displayed a calm intelligence, an almost calculated decision to hand her cub over to him. What did this mean? Was there a purpose behind her choice? He couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was part of something larger, something beyond his comprehension. Could the bear have been aware of something he wasn't? The human had read about the intelligence of animals, particularly grizzlies, but this went beyond typical animal behavior. It was as if the bear understood something about him that he couldn't yet grasp. Had it been instinct or something more? It seemed almost as though the forest itself had conspired to bring them together, as though the ecosystem had chosen him to play a role that he hadn't been prepared for. He thought about the stories he had heard of people who had encountered wild creatures and returned with knowledge, a deeper understanding of the natural world. Those stories were often met with skepticism, but now, standing with the cub in his arms, he began to wonder if there was truth to them. The human's role in this was more than just a passive observer. The bear had chosen him for a reason, and that reason was not yet clear, but it was important. The cub stirred in his arms, its small body shifting as it sought comfort. For a moment, the human allowed himself to simply focus on the cub's warmth, the quiet sound of its breathing. It was an intimate moment, a rare one, but it also felt heavy with expectation. What was he supposed to do next? There had to be something he could do to understand the bear's decision. The world was changing around him, and this encounter seemed to be a signal of something greater. Maybe it was an invitation, a test, or a challenge. Whatever it was, he couldn't ignore it. The encounter had set something in motion, and now he had to see it through, even if he didn't know where it would lead. He realized, with a sudden clarity, that the bear's trust wasn't just a random event. She had left her cub with him, not because of some simple lapse in judgment, but because she had seen something in him. Something that made her believe he could play a role in a much larger plan. The human wasn't just holding a bear cub, he was holding a key, a symbol of humanity's potential to bridge the divide between the natural world and civilization. His thoughts turned to the future. What did this mean for the ecosystem? Could humans be part of something greater, something that allowed them to coexist with nature rather than dominate it? This was no longer a question of survival, it was a question of understanding. He didn't just need to protect the cub, he needed to understand why it had come to him, and why the forest had chosen him to care for it. The future felt uncertain, but one thing was clear, the path ahead was no longer just about exploration or survival. It was about something far greater, something humanity had yet to fully comprehend. And with the cub in his arms, the human had been given a glimpse into that future. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on, because he knew that his journey, and the cub's, was far from over. It had only just begun. As the days passed, the human's bond with the cub deepened. He could feel the weight of his responsibility with every moment, but he also sensed that the connection between them was more than just survival. The cub, now more alert and curious, was no longer the fragile creature it had been when he first found it. It had begun to grow, slowly but surely, and with each passing day, it developed a stronger sense of independence. But it still relied on him, looking to him for guidance, for protection. The human's mind was consumed with questions. The grizzly had made a deliberate choice when she left her cub with him. Why? What was it that she saw in him that led to this decision? He had spent years studying nature, learning the behaviors of wild animals, but nothing had prepared him for this. The cub's trust was absolute, yet the human felt an overwhelming sense of unworthiness. He was an outsider, a creature of reason and technology, not someone born to live in harmony with the wild. Yet the forest seemed to whisper that he was meant for something greater. The signs were subtle, but they were there, an odd sense of calm that enveloped him in the presence of the cub, a heightened awareness of his surroundings, a deepened understanding of the rhythms of the natural world. It was as if the forest itself was teaching him, pulling him deeper into its mysteries. He began to notice patterns in the behavior of the animals around him, rhythms he had never paid attention to before. The way the birds sang, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the movement of the shadows, it all felt connected, as if everything had a purpose. The human was no longer just observing, he was part of the ecosystem in a way he had never imagined. It was a humbling realization. He had always viewed himself as separate from the wild, a visitor rather than a participant. But with the cub by his side, he began to see that he was deeply intertwined with the world around him. His presence here, at this moment, was not by chance. The grizzly had made sure of that. There were moments of uncertainty, times when he wondered if he was truly capable of raising the cub. Could he protect it as the grizzly had? Could he guide it as it grew into the powerful creature it was destined to become? The human didn't have the answers. But he did have something the grizzly had sensed, an understanding that, despite his limitations, he was a part of something much larger, something that transcended his human experience. The forest had chosen him, not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to learn, to adapt. He could feel the weight of the grizzly's decision pressing down on him, and while it was a burden, it was also a gift. The knowledge he had gained in his studies, the experiences he had accumulated, were now being put to the test in ways he had never anticipated. He wasn't just studying the wild anymore, he was living it, breathing it, becoming a part of it. As the cub grew stronger, it became more independent, its instincts sharpening. The human watched in awe as it began to test its boundaries, moving more confidently through the forest, exploring its new world with an insatiable curiosity. But the bond between them remained, unspoken yet undeniable. The human had given the cub a place to belong, and in return, the cub had shown him a new way of seeing the world. The forest was no longer just a collection of trees and wildlife, it was a living, breathing entity that pulsed with life, a force that could no longer be ignored. The human had once thought of himself as an observer, an outsider, but now he was a part of the great web of life that surrounded him. And in that realization, he found a sense of peace. He no longer needed to understand everything, because he understood enough, that he was connected to the world in a way he had never imagined. The cub had shown him that, and the grizzly had trusted him to carry that knowledge forward. The world outside the forest seemed distant now, a far-off memory. The human's place was here, in the heart of the wild, where the boundaries between humanity and nature blurred. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them, for he now understood that his role was not just to survive, but to protect, to learn, and to grow with the forest. The cycle of life was endless, and with the cub by his side, he would continue to be a part of it, forever bound to the wild that had chosen him.